Even though it's been over 20 years, I still remember the very first time I read Dracula and being viscerally disturbed by the scene in which Jonathan Harker looks out a window and sees Count Dracula crawling down the castle wall head first like a lizard. It is so creepy, and it's the moment when Jonathan can no longer explain away the strangeness of his host. Even before this point, Jonathan has sensed something is off, but his suspicion still makes room for explanation. He can tell himself that Dracula is eccentric, foreign, secretive, or simply unfamiliar. But when he sees him on the wall, all of these explanations can no longer hold up. Dracula may still look human, but he's no longer behaving according to any human logic that Jonathan or we understand. And in this moment, the categories Jonathan has been using to make sense of the world totally collapse. This moment captures what makes Dracula such a disturbing figure, and it's why he's part of my series on literary villains, where I explore what these characters reveal about fear, power, desire, control, and human nature that are sometimes closer to us than we'd like to think. Now, before we talk about Dracula, I think we need to get past the version most people think they know. Because popular culture has turned Dracula into this romantic antihero, a seductive aristocrat, a Halloween costume, and sometimes just a joke. But the Dracula who appears in Bram Stoker's novel, he is so much more disturbing. Dracula stands out because he meticulously studies and understands people in order to violate them through their most vulnerable points. This fear resonated deeply with Victorian readers because Stoker was writing during a period of enormous confidence and tremendous anxiety. Science was advancing rapidly as medicine and technology seemed capable of solving problems that previous generations could only imagine. And Britain was the center of a vast empire that prided itself for its modernity, rationality, and security. But at the same time, many people worried that this confidence was fragile. After all, religious certainty had weakened, while traditional social structures were changing, and questions about gender, sexuality, disease, and national identity created a growing sense that the world was becoming harder to navigate and understand. So in enters Dracula into this uncertainty. Now, although he hails from an older Gothic world of castles, superstition, blood, death, and ancient fear, Dracula does not remain trapped there. He adapts. He studies England, purchases property there, arranges transportation, and watches how people live. He learns where people feel safe and then enters through those spaces. So in many ways, he's the kind of predator we are least equipped to detect because he doesn't initially appear as a threat at all. He moves through the home, the bedroom, the trusted relationship, and the ordinary routines of daily life, transforming places associated with security into places of vulnerability. And this is why Jonathan's experience in the castle is so impactful. You see, Dracula doesn't present himself as a monster. He appears instead as a polite, educated, cultured, and seemingly generous host. Jonathan has to discover the danger gradually through a series of details that refuse to fit together and that become incrementally creepy and downright frightening. The servants never appear, the doors remain locked, and Dracula has unnatural strength and no reflection in the mirror. Eventually, Jonathan realizes the truth. He is not a guest in Dracula's home, he is a prisoner. What makes these scenes so unsettling is that Dracula never drops the performance. Even after Jonathan understands the danger, Dracula continues behaving like an aristocratic host. The manners, social role, and politeness all remain intact, which means the horror comes from the gap between what Dracula appears to be and what Jonathan now knows he is. And this gap is one of the novel's central patterns, in that Dracula's power often works by keeping the outer form of something familiar in place while changing what it means underneath. So he doesn't simply destroy a home, a relationship, or a person. He enters it, alters it, and then leaves everyone else trying to understand why something they recognize suddenly feels very wrong. And no character demonstrates this more clearly than Lucy. So Lucy begins the novel as one of its most admired characters. She is beautiful, kind, desirable, and deeply loved by the people around her. Yet part of the tragedy of Lucy is that the men who care about her often seem more attached to the idea of Lucy than to Lucy herself. They celebrate her purity and innocence, but these qualities provide no protection against Dracula. And as it was for all women at this time, it's her body that becomes the place where Victorian fears about female sexuality, male control, illness, purity, and contamination all collide. But the intriguing thing is that Dracula's violence doesn't end with the wound on the neck. His power remakes her by changing what she represents. Innocence becomes appetite, sexuality becomes threat, motherhood becomes predation, and the protected woman becomes something her culture believes must be destroyed. Her vampiric form horrifies these men because it reveals a version of womanhood that their culture simply can't accept or absorb. Sexually assertive, bodily hungry, and no longer available as the pure object of male protection. What Dracula is doing then is turning Lucy into the embodiment of what her culture fears, and then leaving the others to confront the corrupted version of the woman they thought they knew. This transformation reveals something essential about Dracula's power. Again and again, he takes something familiar and then he makes it strange. He doesn't merely attack identities, he alters them and changes the meaning of things entirely. Think about it. Lucy is not terrifying because she's dead. It's because she no longer fits the categories that once made her understandable. And this pattern of corruption doesn't stop with Lucy. Stoker also uses Dracula to imagine a larger cultural fear. What happens when the supposedly protected center of British life is entered, altered, and threatened by something it is defined as foreign and other? Dracula comes from Eastern Europe into England, and Stoker repeatedly codes him through foreignness, superstition, animality, violence, and racialized otherness. Late Victorian Britain was an imperial power increasingly anxious about decline, degeneration, and reverse invasion. So the empire that had expanded outward began imagining threats moving inward. Dracula dramatizes this fear by entering London as a predatory force, planning expansion through blood, reproduction, and contamination. So this imperial dimension is powerful, but also very troubling. Dracula's otherness produces Gothic fear, while the novel also relies on Victorian assumptions that associate the foreign with danger, primitiveness, disease, and moral threat. So reading the novel carefully means seeing how the fear operates inside the fiction and how that fear reflects imperial prejudice rather than simply accepting the novel's terms. And blood is where these fears become physical, because it connects sexuality, inheritance, family, racial identity, spiritual condition, and bodily vulnerability. And Dracula turns it into a medium of control. Think about it. The bite is intimate without being loving. Lucy's transfusions become symbolically charged because men are now giving their blood to her body in ways that raise questions about possession and fidelity. And Mina's forced contact with Dracula's blood marks her as contaminated and connected to him against her will. Vampirism is terrifying because it threatens identity as much as life. Dracula's version of immortality depends on turning people into instruments of his continuation, which makes his appetite expansive rather than momentary. He wants access, circulation, reproduction, and a future built from other people's bodies, a desire that will never be sated. And this hunger has intelligence behind it. Think about it. He studies, plans, waits, relocates, conceals, and chooses his victims carefully, relying on timing, secrecy, social rules, and compromised trust as much as supernatural force. Even the vampire's need for invitation is really horrifying because entry often happens under false conditions when the person who allows access doesn't understand what they've just granted. Now, the final pursuit returns Dracula to the east, and his death can feel surprisingly abrupt after so much buildup, and a lot of readers have been disgruntled by it. But I think abruptness fits the novel's logic because Dracula can't be negotiated with. He can't be cured, reformed, or absorbed into respectable society. The Gothic threat has to be removed so that the violated world can imagine repair, even if the cultural afterlife of Dracula suggests that repair has never felt complete. The fact that Dracula continues to occupy our imagination suggests that the novel's deeper fears have never left us. More than a century later, we still recognize and identify with the anxieties Stoker attached to him. We worry about manipulation, contamination, vulnerability, and the possibility that danger may arrive disguised as something familiar. So for you, what makes Dracula so disturbing? Is it the blood, the sexuality, the invasion of the home or body, the fear of becoming something other than yourself? Or the realization that the things we trust most can sometimes become the very things that make us vulnerable? And do you think versions of Dracula are still very much present in our society and culture today? Let me know in the comments, and if you're enjoying this series on literature's most disturbing villains, be sure to subscribe. My philosophy here on this channel is to make literature relatable and human again, and to show you how the stories are really speaking about each and every one of us. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you guys in the next one. Be well.